What's the biggest elephant in the room you've ever experienced? So, I'm in this class. It was pretty small and a fairly social group. And one night we decide we will all hit a bar after class to have a drink and unwind. We're all having a great time, and a few beers rapidly become an entire night of drinking and bar hopping. After a bit, one of the guys in the class, a rather unassuming nerd type, slams his drink on the table and seemingly makes up his mind that he's going to get some that night. It probably didn't help that we were telling embellished tales of our own exploits and encouraging him, though. He goes to the first girl and has surprisingly good luck initially. There's only one problem: she's sitting at a table with her boyfriend. At first, he was just sitting next to him across from the girl and chatting them both up. Then, with all the subtlety of a freight train, he crosses the table to sit next to her. And surprisingly, the boyfriend lets it slide, I assume because he is the least threatening looking person in the world and also very geeky. A group watches in amazement and horror as he puts his hand around her shoulders and proceeds to move it lower by an inch every 5 seconds. And by the time he reaches the waist, she pushes him out and yells at him. He tried to sit back down a few times but was welcomed only with slight kicks to the hip. The boyfriend stops laughing for a moment to motion for him to go away. He comes back devastated. He mopes for a second, mutters about how women are all ice queens, and then returns to the bar to chat up another girl. Since his last object of desire had to make a scene, he really could not get past saying hello to any other women there. After a short amount of time, we all leave as a group to go to the next bar. I'm playing a game of pool with my friends, and while our tipsy introvert on a mission of love is trying his luck with a new cast of women at the new bar. From the looks of things, he's failing miserably. A few minutes later, I hear a commotion and turn to see three bartenders in my classmate's face yelling at him as he profusely apologizes. Before I had time to know what was going on, they threw him out of the bar. In the meantime, a very pissed off waitress who I am acquainted with slightly explains that he made advances at her very obviously after taking his drink order. We were all mortified by the behavior, but glad that he was kicked out and we could continue to have fun while he slept it off. At that point, we heard his muffled voice from outside the window screaming, "I'm sorry," and "I love you" to the waitress. They'd never met. Finally, after the threat from the police, he took off in a sprint across the parking lot and into the night. The next day at class, he nervously asked me, "So, did anything happen last night?" Aw, dang, buddy here had a bit too much liquid courage. And as much as I'd want to say I admire his persistence, it ain't cool when you cross that boundary into other people's private personal space, you know what I mean? Story 2. Okay, my ex, who I was with for about 4 years, her mother was a bit crazy. I think with the benefit of distance and hindsight, that my ex's father probably doesn't experience attraction and basically she went looking elsewhere for her needs. When I met my ex and was introduced to her family a few weeks after we started going out, the mother was living with her boyfriend and shared the master bedroom. My ex's father lived in the same house in a downstairs bedroom. The mother's new husband, I think they got married while I was dating my ex, but if so, it was a very small ceremony and no fuss was made about it, had been their boss when my ex's mother and father were still married, and she had carried on an affair together for years before they all built this new house together and all moved in together, as described. I have no idea at all how this was eventually negotiated between them. My ex had 3 brothers and a sister. 2 of the brothers were twins, and the big elephant in the room was that they were the result of an affair the mother had carried on 20 years before. Everyone seemed to know this except the brothers in question, and it was talked about fairly openly, at least amongst the other kids in their 20s when the twins weren't around. While my ex was growing up, her father used to occasionally and tearfully confide in her about what a witch the mother was, and my ex used to urge him to divorce. A few years later, my ex was mistreated by another guy who the mother had an affair with. At that time, the mother was witchy to my ex because she was getting the guy's attention. I think this is a not uncommon phenomenon, and I don't believe this stuff was so widely known amongst the other family members, but it was certainly a little elephantine for me. In the past, my ex had hated her mom and had left home as soon as she had been legally allowed to, rarely returning home for visits. After the mom finally moved in with her steady boyfriend, whom I think she eventually married, and the father/ex-husband living in the spare bedroom, things seemed to stabilize. And my ex would visit. She got along very well with her dad and he was happy and content in this final arrangement. However, my ex and her mother still argued occasionally, and getting on with them was pretty much a matter of going back to visit and pretending that the previous dispute had never happened. The mother was pretty vacuous, really, and would make a big deal of being nice to people, and you just had to play along with it and basically pretend like she wasn't a complete witch. Story 3. I'd went too many drinks and got with a girl I really wasn't that into on a Friday. It was a roomed elephant because she was visiting my roommate's girlfriend and planning on staying at my house the rest of the weekend. She was visibly upset when I wore shorts to bed the next night. Another time, I invited a girl I'd known in high school to a concert. I wasn't really into her in high school, but I thought maybe I just never really got to know her. It turns out I got to know her just fine and I wasn't interested whatsoever. She decided she was too tipsy to drive home when we got back to my house, where her car was parked. With every ounce of restraint within me, I kept a straight face as I got a blanket out of the closet and put it on the couch for her. I went upstairs to go to bed. She sent me a text message that was very simply composed of a sad emoji. The phrase sad face from the couch is now an inside joke between me and my roommate. The next morning, I stayed in my room as long as I could stand it. I got a call from a coworker saying he went to the office and locked his keys in there. I went to leave to let him in, and she was still there, on the couch, watching the Travel Channel. I told her I had to let my buddy in the building, left, and just sat at work on a Sunday morning chatting with him until he was finished doing whatever he was doing. I returned home, now about 11:30 a.m., and she was still there. She asked if I wanted to go to lunch. I told her I had to check with my family because my sister was graduating from high school that afternoon, which was true, and they had mentioned getting together for lunch, which was not true. I ran upstairs, called my mom, chatted with her for a second, and then said, "Are we getting together for lunch before the ceremony?" My mom, as wonderful and predictable as ever, said, "I hadn't planned on it, but we can if you want to. You'll have to drive over here right now since we'll be cutting it close on time." I apologized and left immediately, and thankfully she was gone by the time I got home at like 8 p.m. Okay, so this is one of those situations where it's just better to get it over with, like ripping off a band-aid, instead of having to endure 1,000 cuts of awkwardness. Story 4. My old boss is the nicest guy you'd ever meet, with some very oddball tastes and a history to match. He was a Christian brother when he was younger. At the time, he was apparently also very into tanning, like greasing up and going to the beach while living in Florida. He later left the brotherhood, got married, and moved on to the art and antiques business. He always dressed very well and absolutely loved Dancing with the Stars. He had no children, but did have a dog, a Shih Tzu named after one of the three tenors that he wouldn't let go outside. If it did go outside, he would make sure to wash its paws immediately upon returning. Everything had to be meticulously clean at all times, and he was a bit of a germaphobe. He also had an almost unhealthy obsession with hearing stories from my one openly flamboyant coworker. He would always come into work hours before anyone else. I always assumed he did so to pass rush hour and get a kickstart on his day's work. We worked together at a very high-end art gallery, and the front door was always locked, so you needed to ring the doorbell or have a key to get in. I was always the second one to get there in the morning. But one morning, I came in and did my usual routine. As I round the corner to say my usual good morning, I see that he has some particular websites open on his screen. The night before, someone had been turning off the lights and accidentally turned off the doorbell that sounded when the door was opening. So he didn't know I was there and hadn't finished his, browsing. My first reaction was to look away, but he insisted that I turn completely around so he could close what he was doing, saying something about how I ruined his quote-unquote joke that he was planning on pulling with me and my coworker. Of course, he never pulled any jokes before or after that, and we never mentioned the incident again. Story 5. I had a systems analysis class in college, and for a class project, we were supposed to design an information retrieval system for a professor who had collected a database of information in a word processor format. The class members were duly anointed with their titles, and off to meetings we went. One thing that stood out in the problem was that the database already existed, the data had been entered, it was formatted, and the retrieval requirements were minimal. It was a simple entry of a Latin name that would bring up a datasheet for a plant. While class members were discussing the different modules of the solution, I noted one of these was a data entry module. This was not a trivial task given that we were in the dark ages before Windows and all those wonderful built-in editing controls. I tried to convince her that there was no need for a data entry module, even after checking with the client that indeed there was no more data to be entered. All we needed was a simple data retrieval system. And I kept getting blown off. I kept reminding them that what they were proposing would require the minimum of a data conversion, a full design specification for the data entry, and all the editing tools that would have to be written from scratch, but nobody wanted to talk about that. They were all trying to make the project really professional or whatever. Nobody wanted to get down to the nitty gritty of what exactly this data entry module would take to build, so I walked. This was to be a design only project to be handed off to a software engineering class in the next semester to implement. I never took that class, but I met one time with another student I greatly respected and asked him how his software engineering class was going. He said, "Oh man, they gave us this stupid spec with one line calling for the biggest hassle of the whole assignment, and it's completely unnecessary." I felt vindicated, but not completely. I should have gotten them to acknowledge that elephant, but I failed. Story 6. I once worked part time for a training center that had various vocational departments such as wood metalwork, car mechanics, bricklaying, photography, my department where I did tuition, and IT. The IT department was unique in that it was run a bit like a franchise. The owners of the center contracted a lady to run the IT department for a single fee. They simply gave her some rooms, a pile of cash, and told her to train people in basic IT skills. The problem was that she was completely insane. She would throw her students' discs, umbrellas, cables, or whatever was lying around. Sometimes she would roll up in a ball on the floor and cry. There was never any obvious reason for this behavior, apart from insanity. This led the owners to decide to get rid of her. She did have a contract, but it was assumed she had well and truly broken it. She had been called into a meeting of department heads and told she had to leave after collecting her personal belongings. Myself and some other members of staff were asked to wait in the IT rooms to make sure she didn't take anything that did not belong to her. She came flying into the IT department rooms like a screaming child. She picked up her briefcase and threw it through a window. Next, she went around, knocking over shelves and each PC in turn. Then she started throwing around anything that wasn't already destroyed. I got bumped by a flying VHS D-based training tape. All the other people in the room were just staring at her like it was no big deal. I turned to a department head who was standing next to me and implied that I was ready to manhandle her out of the building and call the local mental hospital. He looked at me and whispered, "No, we don't want to give her any excuse to sue us." That whole episode was surreal. Whoa, have you guys ever seen an elephant trash a whole place and then just pretend it's normal like in this one? Now, speaking of which, I'll address one elephant right now while we're on a break. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help me out. On to the next story. Story 7. Recently, I ran into two of my friends, Kate and Steve, while I was grocery shopping. I asked them what was going on, and they told me they were making sundaes. Odd, I thought, because why wouldn't Kate be making sundaes with her boyfriend, Ben? I asked them if Ben was involved, and Kate just kind of shrugged it off. As soon as Kate walked to another aisle, Steve blurted out that Kate wanted to break up with Ben, who she's been seeing for almost 2 years, very badly. He swore me to secrecy just as she came back. A few days later, at Kate's birthday party, she was hanging all over Steve the entire night in front of Ben. By the looks on everyone's faces, we all knew what was going on. The worst part was seeing the hopeful look on Ben's face when he told Kate he loved her and watching her lie to him. Another one, last year at my cousin's bachelorette party, she gave out lollipops. Her future husband's brother, who is married and has kids, sat down next to me as I was enjoying my lollipop. He began flirting with me while watching me and badgered me about showing tricks with a lollipop. I said no, but he kept pressing me. I stayed as far away from him as I could at the wedding. A few months later, I ran into him buying a beer keg and he said, "Hey, after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about you. Could you show me again what you did?" I made an excuse about needing to get home and booked it. Alright, so man, this first part's just like the last story. Like, why do we prolong our own misery? I mean, I do feel for Ben, but that girl, Kate, would have been so much happier, quicker, if she just straight up told Ben that she's more into Steve. Also, hold on, why is there a dude anyway at a bachelorette's party? Story 8. There will always be a ton of these as long as my mother is around. She loves to blather on and is probably the most insensitive person I've ever known. Examples: my cousin had struggled with a disorder for years, being in and out of therapy, and at one point living with us to go to a special clinic. My cousin got over it. Then, one Thanksgiving, when my cousin arrived, my mother greeted her with a smile and said, "Oh, Kathy, you've become rounder again." My dad had to take my mother into another room and give her a talking to. She still probably didn't realize what was wrong with what she said. While visiting my relatives in the Philippines, my mother turns to my young Filipina cousin and says, while laughing, "Why aren't your chests growing? Look at my daughter. She's American. She has big ones." I felt so bad for my cousin and so embarrassed because of my mother. My paternal grandfather passed away, and my father told me to take my mother shopping for a black outfit for the funeral. At the store, the salesperson asked if this was for any special occasion, and my mother said, with a big, goofy smile and laugh, "My mother in law passed away." I felt sick. To make things worse, no amount of explaining will get through to her as to why what she did was wrong. I'm just telling what's the problem. She does that sort of thing all the time, like delivering bad or embarrassing news while laughing. To be clear, she doesn't intend any malice. She just likes talking and gossiping and is completely oblivious to context and other people's feelings. Story 9. 2 years ago, my 40-year-old cousin showed up at Christmas, obviously baked. Everyone knows about his habit. His poor high school age son holds on. He's on his way to a good university with all sorts of well deserved scholarships, but at least we never have to worry about him going down that road. His dad, age 67, and stepmom, age 56, sort of ignore the whole thing since they're just happy to have him around at the holidays. My folks are unbelievably oblivious since they're otherwise engaged with preparing the family meal and are just glad he's not sleeping on the couch, as is his usual custom. My sisters, in their 20s, and their boyfriends and husbands are in the same boat as me, feeling awkward. Because we're in the non judgmental demographic, he feels comfortable rambling and lying to us, but what are we supposed to do? Anyway, he doesn't really totally ruin anything, he just makes it awkward as hell for half of the room in the know. I guess you could say he's a quote unquote functional junkie, if such a thing exists. He's not really functional, but he didn't ruin this particular holiday or anything. I got the gifts I was hoping for too, so I got that going for me. Grandma is just happy to be around. Wait, so there is such a thing as a functional junkie? Trust me. But help tickle my curiosity here. Are you really that quote unquote non judgmental? If you're just going to be thinking and acting like you are, but really, like here in this story, you're silently judging still anyway? Story 10. This old woman at my work has some hygiene issues. Normally, it's not so bad, but one day you could smell something as soon as you got out of the lift. I don't have words to describe how awful it was. Anyone went on the entire floor, they could smell it. People were making excuses to go to other floors and stay there for as long as possible. Now, there are over 60 people who work on my floor, and no one said a word. Everyone just tolerated it or quietly left the floor. A woman from another floor arrived and said in a loud voice, "What's that awful smell?" Someone shushed her and whispered what it was, and the woman joined the conspiracy of silence without another word. For a full day, 60 people suffered because of this woman. That was the elephant in the room, and not one single person broke and told her. Even now, nobody speaks of that day. We just silently hope it never happens again. Story 11. My father was a tippler, a quiet one, but a tippler nonetheless. He sat in front of the television every night after work and drank until he was tipsy enough to go to sleep. Everything that happened in that house revolved around his dependency. No one ever talked about it. Dad watched a lot of TV and kept to himself, and that was all, as far as anyone else in the house was concerned. Once he accidentally hurt me. I assure you, it was accidental when I was a kid. My mom heard me yelling from the other room and told my brother to quit tormenting me. When I yelled back that it wasn't my brother, but rather my dad, she didn't say a word. That's how much we ignored that elephant. My brother could hurt me, and you can bet my mom wouldn't let it slide, but when the tipsy guy hit me, it was taboo to confront it. He eventually went to therapy, and I was expected to confront all those emotions, feelings, and truths that I had been raised from day one to believe were anathema. So stupid. Story 12. A few years ago, I was doing my thesis defense for my undergrad degree. I was in the honors program for my department, and my presentation was open to the public. My mom came, but she was totally out of it. She reeked like booze. Anyone who has smelled that smell knows what I'm talking about. Everyone in the room knew, including my peers, my advisors, everyone. She even asked a few questions after my presentation. I feel like I passed away up there from shame and hurt. It was all I could do to keep from crying. Everyone knew. It's not like she was there to ruin my special day. That's not it. Her dependence was a great source of very private pain in my life. And now it was something everyone in my professional life knew. No one said a thing to me about it, ever. Story 13. Years ago at a publishing company, this guy had convinced the CEO that this kid's story he created was awesome and amazing, and we could make it into a range of toys, books, animation, etc. It was terrible, like so very, very bad. We used to see every creative property traveling around, and we published a variety of stuff so we knew our market, knew what was good and bad, but because it was the CEO, everyone had to stay quiet. Entire meetings where this is complete trash thought bubbles were hanging in the air. Entire meetings with 20 people pretending the giant elephant has this is going to lose you all money because it's total trash painted on it, ignored. It was terrible. It lost money and probably contributed to the downfall of the company in the end. Ignore elephants at your work to your peril. Alright, after hearing about these truly massive metaphorical elephants, please don't forget to address the smaller ones in your own life, okay? Now hop on over to the next video. What's something obvious you just realized? And check out story 1. It made me realize that the most obvious things are the ones we miss entirely. Makes enough sense eventually, right? I'll see you there, and thank you for watching this one.